Hey everybody, and welcome back to another Word on Fire Institute webinar. My name is Matt Nelson. I'm the Assistant Director of the Word on Fire Institute. And we're going to be spending about 30 to 40 minutes now here talking about how to win souls and influence people. Sounds like a pretty tall order. And really what my plan is here is to provide for you 7 practical tips that you can use in your daily life to become a more confident apologist for the faith. That's the main goal of this webinar, is to make you more confident in speaking about the faith, and in particular, speaking about the faith to people who disagree with you, that don't believe the things that you believe. So, like I said, hopefully what you're going to take away from this is some practical ideas, things that you can continue to do when this webinar is over, and ultimately you'll become a more confident explainer and defender of the faith. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to begin by a brief introduction just into what apologetics are. Now, the thing about apologetics is, like, probably to you who are watching, you're familiar with the word, you're probably pretty good as an apologist already. But I still run into people today who have never heard that word before. So we're talking about how to become better apologists. Well, what does the word mean? I remember the first time that I encountered the word apologetics. I was in my early 20s, I was going to university, and I started to cruise the internet. At the time, I had fallen away from the faith. I was treading the line of skepticism. I really wasn't very interested in Christianity at all. And I stumbled across a website. It was a religious website, and it had questions that Christians, and in particular Catholics, would expect to be asked by people who don't believe what they believe, and then answers as responses to those questions. And I noticed, I associated this strange word with these responses, and the word was apologetics. And I remember thinking, this is so strange. What a terrible word for what they're doing here. It sounds like the opposite. It doesn't sound like defending. It sounds like saying, I'm sorry for what I believe. That website, by the way, happened to be the old Catholic Answers website. And so at the time, I looked at the answers a little bit, and it was years later when I would come back to the faith. But that was my first introduction to the word apologetics. Many of you will know 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 15, and that's St. Peter's call to us to always be prepared to make a defense for the hope that is within us. And then he adds, and do it with gentleness and reverence. That's kind of the primary line of scripture where we tend to go when we talk about our call to defend the faith when necessary. And really what St. Peter is saying is prepare, be ready to do that. And so that's really what we're doing today. I was interested, where did the word apologetics or the word apology split and become, have these two contrary meanings? One being I'm sorry, which is typically what we mean when we say apology today, and this ancient meaning of apology, which meant a defense. I did a little bit of digging, and eventually the Oxford English Dictionary gave me the answer I was looking for. The first time that the word apology was used in the sense of I'm sorry was, it's probably something you would guess, it was William Shakespeare in Richard III in that play. We owe more to Shakespeare, I think, than most of us realize, with the many words he coined out of thin air and phrases. And that's just one more thing we can attribute to the bard. So the word apology today can have either meaning, but today when we're talking in a religious context, when we say apologetics, we mean explaining and defending the faith. Now, many of you will also be familiar with that famous quote from Archbishop Fulton Sheen. He said, you can win an argument, but lose a soul. And he's dead right. That's exactly what we don't want to do. Apologetics is not primarily about winning arguments. It is about giving good arguments. It is about disagreeing, but always in love and always with the primary intention of winning people for the Lord, bringing people, drawing people closer to the true faith and to their Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. That's our goal. So winning arguments is secondary in that sense. Bishop Barron, in his book, Arguing Religion, he talks about how today, particularly on the internet, it's evident that people don't really know how to give a good religious argument today. A lot of times you can see people kind of betray this ignorance and this inability to marshal evidence and construct syllogisms, to find the conclusions that follow from premises, and to to speak kindly and listen attentively. And that, he says, is primarily because of an assumption people make. People assume that when we argue religion, when we disagree on religious things, there's only two camps you can be in. You can either be in the camp of bland tolerance, where there's really no arguing to be had because that's just not appropriate. And so your opinion is yours, mine is mine. Let's just not even get into the arguing. And then there's this other end of the spectrum that people believe exists. When they think of arguing religion, they think of aggressive, maybe even violent imposing of the faith. And so Bishop Barron says, well, there's a middle way that we need to go for. To give a good religious argument, you got to be sharp. You got to be ready to give arguments, to give rebuttals to arguments against your position. But you got to do it in love, and you got to do it ultimately on the basis of friendship. And that is what we're aiming to do. And I'm hoping that the 7 tips that I can share with you today, that they'll help you to do that. Got to remember, I like what Peter Kreeft says about what apologetics is. He says apologetics is the courtship of souls. And if we remember that, we will win souls for the Lord. Now, some of you might be a little put off about this idea of winning souls for the Lord, right? Because it's God who does the converting, isn't it? Yes, but he invites us to be participants in that act of converting others. Remember St. Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 22, when he says, I have become all things to all men, that by all means I might save some. Now, is St. Paul the savior of the people he's evangelizing? No. But in a sort of participatory or secondary way, God invites him to play an active role in the conversion of others. That's what we're trying to do as apologists. Okay, so let's jump into the 7 tips. And these tips are largely drawn from apologists who are much more experienced than I am, who have paid their dues, who have seen years and years of facing people that disagree with them. And these are the things that I've gleaned from watching the greatest apologists who have lived in the tradition, especially in the last century or two. So the first tip that I want to convey to you is this. Pray without ceasing. You go back to 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, that's what Paul tells us to do. Pray without ceasing. Prayer will be the foundation upon which your apologetics endeavors will be founded. They will give the life and the firmness and the efficacy to your attempt to argue for the truth. If you don't have an active interior life, and if you don't marry together the contemplative life with the active life, you're going to struggle. We need as much help as we can get, and you all know that. A book that I want you to get for yourself, and if you like reading on a screen, I don't, so I like to buy hard copies, get this book, The Soul of the Apostolate. About 10 years ago, when I started to consider, this was right after my conversion, coming back to the Catholic faith, I was talking to a prominent Catholic evangelist, somebody who's very active today and has wide influence in the Christian world as an apologist. And he said, this is the first book that you need to read if you want to go into ministry. This isn't just a book for people who are in, professional ministry. We're all ministers. We're all missionaries by virtue of the fact that we're Christians. And so this is the first book that you want to read. You can get it free online, so look it up. It's called The Soul of the Apostolate by Jean-Baptiste Chotard. Great book. And this was Pope St. Pius X's bedside book. So you want to get that. Pray without ceasing. So as an apologist, what does this mean? Well, number one, you want to pray before you encounter anybody in an apologetic scenario. So pray that you will spot the opportunity when someone is open to hearing about the faith. Pray that in that moment that you'll have the words, that maybe you'll have the wisdom to know that you don't need to speak in that moment. Pray before you're in the situation and get heaven working on it now so that when you come into that moment in your life, you've already started to do the work. When you're amidst apologetics, when you're defending and explaining the faith and you're sitting across from somebody, remember to pray in those scenarios too, which can be tough because you're thinking, you're listening, but prayer can just be simply the will to call upon the help of God. But remember God in those moments. If you have a chance, call on the name of Jesus. And something I think we forget is that the angels are there to help us. Somebody once told me, if you call on all the guardian angels in the room, you will have the other person outnumbered. automatically. You just got to do the math. So remember the angels, get them helping you out. And then finally, remember to pray after you've had an encounter with somebody. So you want to pray maybe that you have another opportunity to continue the conversation you had. That maybe that if you spoke error, that won't be accepted as truth by them. That if you maybe lost your temper or in some way was off-putting with your demeanor, that wouldn't have a lasting effect. Or maybe that the right next person in their life would come into the picture to continue what you've started. Maybe that's a good thing to pray for. The point is, you gotta be praying all the time as an apologist. The best apologists in the faith do that, and we gotta be doing that. So let's move on now to the second tip. I think that's all I want to say about that. But I do want to again emphasize that is the foundation of our work as apologists. Pray, pray, pray. All right, number 2, prepare, prepare, prepare. And I wanted to emphasize this because remember, this is what St. Peter asks of us. It's what he commands us to do in his first epistle in the New Testament. Always be prepared to make a defense for the hope that is within you. And in our day and age, you will be asked to give an account. So we need to get our hands dirty. We gotta be ready. If you need a standard to strive for, to know how prepared do I want to be? Not that you need to be this prepared, but how prepared do I want to be? Think about St. Thomas Aquinas in his Summa. Now, what does he do there? He presents opposing arguments to the beliefs of the faith. So, say in his article on the existence of God, where he talks about there's the argument from scientism that belief in God is superfluous. It's not necessary because physical causes are enough to explain the phenomena that we experience in the world around us, or the problem of evil. Well, what he does is, in a very articulate, fair, and rigorous way, he proposes the opposing arguments first, and then he rebuts them. That's the standard we want to go for. We want to know what to expect when we encounter somebody who disagrees with us on the things we believe. It's good for us to aim for the ability to be able to actually state the argument of the other person as good or even better than they can. So hold that as your standard. You got to be reading all the time. This is the great thing about our age. It's an unprecedented time of accessibility to good resources. Books, obviously, are a good way to go. There's something unique that happens neurologically when we read, as opposed to look at a screen or even sit in a lecture and listen. Reading allows us to really engage with ideas. And so you want to read good books. But you want to make sure they're good books, because there's way more books than you're ever going to be able to read in your lifetime of all the books that you should read. So look for recommended book lists from trusted sources. Go to the Word on Fire website. We have tons of book recommendations there. Inside the Institute at wordonfire.institute in the forums, those are some of the busiest threads in the forums is talking about book recommendations. Go to Catholic Answers at their website, catholic.com. They've got great book recommendations, or strangenotions.com, where you're going to find more great recommendations. The point is, read the books that are recommended by people you trust. And there's an endless number of great resources. But also use the digital resources. Like, you have access now, because of YouTube, to lectures by world-class thinkers. So get a pen and paper out and take notes like you're a student as you're watching these lectures on YouTube. And the beautiful thing about it is you can just watch the lecture again. You can watch as often as you want and really let the ideas that they're proposing sink in. I want to recommend another book, and that's How to Read a Book. And maybe you think you don't need to read that book because you already know how to read a book. Well, this is written by one of the only people that I think could have written this sort of treatment of how to enhance your skills of reading a book. And that was Mortimer Adler, 20th century philosopher who eventually converted to Catholicism. This book is is fantastic. Not only does it teach you practical ways of reading different kinds of literature, but it teaches you how to make notes with a pencil or a pen in your book, or symbols, different things to really interact and engage and chew on the ideas there. So get How to Read a Book by Mortimer Adler, and that'll really help you out. I know for me, when I'm reading, I always have a pencil in my hand. That's just the only way that I can do it, even with fiction, to underline, to make symbols, that sort of thing. So engage with the literature, engage with the video and the other media resources we have, and prepare. And then you'll be confident the next time you meet somebody who disagrees with you. You'll be ready to go. And I want to say one more thing. Look for real life scenarios. The best way to practice being an apologist, defending and explaining the faith, is to bring up conversations with people that you suspect won't agree with you, and try to enter into these conversations. And granted, at the beginning, you're probably going to get stumped. You're probably going to feel uncomfortable. But that's how you get better. You've got to throw yourself into the fire. And I'm going to offer you some more tips here to kind of help you gauge those uncomfortable situations where you feel like you don't know what to say. So let's move on to the next tip. The next tip is number 3, be adaptive. In a scenario where you're explaining and defending the faith, and really in any human conversation, it's an evolving situation. It's an evolving situation because human beings are complex. Emotions that are there in the beginning, they might go away, they might be stirred up. Certain ideas that you thought were the primary issue with the person, eventually you might realize those were actually secondary. There's something bigger going on that's driving the rest of the objections the person has. An analogy to this is, so in my former life as a chiropractic clinician, I would see a lot of athletes in my clinic. And so they would come in often with hip pain or low back pain. And so they'd come in, I'd take a history, I'd do a physical examination, I'd do some orthopedic tests to make a diagnosis, and then I would follow a protocol of treatment. And often the treatment would be spinal manipulation or joint mobilization, soft tissue therapy. I'd prescribe exercises. And typically with standard low back or hip pain, if I followed the protocols, they'd get better. And most of the time, it was only in a matter of days. But there's about 10% of that population, of that athletic population, that would stump me. They'd come in with what looked like standard low back or hip pain. And I do everything I do for everybody else that always works. And they'd come back a few days later and they wouldn't be better. And maybe they'd be worse. And so I'd get stumped and I'd start thinking to myself, well, there's got to be something deeper going on here. And so I would move distal, I'd move away from where the pain was, and I would start to think mechanically, is there something going on silently somewhere else that's actually the core problem? So I'd check their knee, and then I'd check their ankle, and then I'd check their feet and even their toes. And sometimes I'd find like a restricted toe. Maybe they had broken their toe in the past and there was lots of scar tissue buildup there, or restricted ankle bone. There's all kinds of things that could have went on. And I would find a painless mechanical issue lower down on what we would call the kinetic chain. So when you think about this, when you run or when you step, their point of contact is your heel. And the forces coming from contact with the ground travel up your leg, eventually to your hip and your low back. The joints and the tissues around them act like shock absorbers. And so if you've got stiff joints that are restricted and not doing their job as shock absorbers, your higher joints, your hip and your low back, say, take more of the stress. And so the problem was a silent one lower down in these people. And so as soon as I cleared away the bigger problem that was hiding from me at first, then the other problems were much easier to treat and they would go away. That's how apologetics works often. People are complex. You're going to discover that what initially appeared to be an intellectual opposition to the faith is actually at a deeper level, more existential, more personal. Or over the course of speaking to somebody that disagrees with you, in the beginning of the conversation, they're angry, or you can see in their eyes like they're not going to listen to anything you have to say. And so you sit back, you orient yourself to the situation, and then eventually, when you see them calm down, and a lot of times just through body language alone, you can tell, oh, they're listening to me now when I ask questions or when I speak. And then you identify an opportunity for you to change your game plan. So now you go from the listening stage to the speaking stage. And there's always an alternation there. I want to offer you a little system that you can use to properly orient yourself through the evolving situation when you're talking to someone who disagrees with you. Maybe you've heard this name, maybe you haven't. There's this fighter pilot. His name's John Boyd. He was one of the greatest American fighter pilots of the 20th century. He was a Korean War veteran, and he spent time in Nevada at this prestigious Air Force base where the most elite of the American Air Force would train. He was there as a student, rose through the ranks, and eventually was given a job as an instructor there, which was in the Air Force one of the most prestigious offers that you could ever receive as a fighter pilot, is to be an instructor at this particular Air Force base. And his nickname came to be 42nd Boyd. And the reason why they called him 42nd Boyd is because they would do these mock dogfights in the air. And Boyd would challenge every pilot who ever entered the base. He says, let's go up in the air, you and your fighter jet, me and mine. I'll start at a position of disadvantage, and I'll give you $40, which was more back then. I'll give you $40 if you can outmaneuver me in 40 seconds. Here's the thing about Boyd. He never had a bad day. Over all the years that he was at that base as an instructor, nobody ever outmaneuvered him. And so he was one of the greatest fighter pilots in U.S. Air Force history. And there's reasons why he was good at what he did. And one of the reasons was he had this system of thinking when he was up in the air. He knew that it wasn't just what your jet can do. It wasn't just about that. It was also about what the other fighter is thinking. So he had this simple acronym. He calls it the OODA loop. And it's an acronym, OODA, for observe, orient, decide, and act. And when you act, you loop around back to observe, collect more data, reorient yourself to the new data, the new situation, make a decision about what to do based off of the new data, and then act. That OODA loop is so useful that today, not just in the military, but in business, in sports, even in law, it's implemented to help people work through changing situations. So go online, do some research on this OODA loop, and I think it could be helpful in real life apologetic scenarios where you're dealing with human beings who have emotions and arguments. And I think that's really helpful. So do that. Let's move on to our fourth tip, which is listen. Now, don't turn off your computer. I know that's a boring tip, and we all know we need to listen. But why are we so bad at it? I think we just need to be reminded of this because we're often just not good at it. And it's because we let our emotions get the best of us. You know, somebody who I've noticed is really good at listening in high-profile, apologetic, or debate-type scenarios is an atheist. His name is Graham Oppy. He's one of the most formidable atheists working in academia who specializes in philosophy of religion and has debated the greatest living Christian apologist today. He's went up against William Lane Craig, our Catholic philosopher, a favorite among many, Edward Feser, and others. And if you go to YouTube and you go to Capturing Christianity, it's this really good show with Cameron Bertuzzi where he often positions a non-believer and a believer, or two people who disagree, together, and they enter into a charitable dialogue with each other about their disagreements. If you go watch Oppy, he's so congenial. He listens closely. You can kind of tell in his body language sometimes when he starts to disagree with something, but he's calm. And then when he finally does speak, he's just so clear and articulate and kind that it's disarming. So I think, there's an atheist for us to exemplify in that way. So we got to listen. Often we don't make the distinction between hearing and listening. And this is a distinction that Mortimer Adler makes in another one of his good books called How to Speak and How to Listen. So in that book, he clarifies the difference between hearing and listening in this way. He says, listening, as opposed to hearing, involves the mind. It's active versus passive. And he compares it to a catcher in baseball. So we think of the catcher as being on the receptive end, as being maybe passive. He has to go where the pitcher pitches the ball. We often don't think about how involved being a catcher in baseball really is. That was my position when I played Little League. And I can tell you, you leave the game as a catcher probably more sore than everybody else, not just because you're crouched for the whole game, but because you're on the move, adapting all the time. And so it is an active position. And I think it's a great analogy that Adler provides for us. So we got to be active listeners. I have another acronym that I like to encourage people to remember. And this is not my original acronym in the sense that all I've done is watch people who are really good at listening and agreeing and disagreeing and just kind of artfully being able to disarm their opponents with kindness, but without compromising the fact that they disagree with them. And I've derived this simple acronym from it. So the acronym is this: LADI, lady. It's the lady approach, we could call it. L is for listen, A is for agree, D is for disagree, and I is invite a response. Now, where I really saw this come alive is in watching pro-life apologists in the Catholic Church. Watching, in particular, Trent Horn and Stephanie Gray. They would go on live Catholic radio, usually Catholic Answers Live, and they would have Why Are You Pro-Choice call-in shows. And one of the things I noticed that they would do in those live shows and in the debates that they're in is they were really good at, when they finally opened their mouth, they would always begin with something they agreed with. And yet they didn't stop there. They weren't just trying to make friends and not take the chance of offending through disagreement, but rather they began with something congenial, with a point of commonality, and then they moved from agreeing to then their disagreement. So I agree with you that if God was a being among beings, if he was a physical thing that was in the universe, then yeah, science would give us good reason to doubt the existence of God. But I disagree with you that that's the nature of God, because I believe that God is transcendent. He's the cause, the explanation of all physical reality. So he's beyond physical reality. What do you think of that? There's your invitation to respond. So you listen to what they're saying, you agree on something, find something some common ground that you stand upon, then gently offer your disagreement, and instead of going on and on about why you disagree, invite a response, and that creates dialogue. So that's what you want to do. That's the LADI acronym, LADI. Let's move on to tip number 5. Ask good questions. So number 1, it's just important to ask questions because it keeps the dialogue going and it involves the other person, makes them feel like you're not just interested in talking and stating your position, but that you're interested in the other person. And there's this process of earning the right then to share your disagreements, where first you put in your time of being interested in the other person. And that interest should never go away, but eventually they'll be okay with you talking a little bit too. So you want to ask good questions. Blaise Pascal in the 17th century, in his famous Pensées, he wrote about religious indifference, and he said, men fear religion. They're afraid it may be true. I'll let you think about that line a little bit. But what he said is the way that people tend to avoid religion as people who are afraid of it. Maybe they're afraid of the implications it would have on their life and the changes that they would have to make, is 2 things he identifies. He says people either fall into diversion, that is, they divert their attention from thinking about life's big questions and the what if it is true type questions, or they just fall into indifference and they refuse to take seriously any discussion or question involving the Christian faith. Well, that's true still today. And I think that behind all diversion and indifference is still the human longing to know the answers to life's deepest questions. And that's been my experience with the most indifferent, most distracted people that I've ever encountered, where I've entered into a conversation about religion. If I do it right, and I haven't always done it right, but when I would get things right, I would soon find under those layers of diversion and indifference true concern about life's big questions, which are inherently religious. And so asking good questions is a way to get down into that genuine curiosity that lies under the superficial layer of indifference and diversion. So ask good questions. Pro-life apologists are really good at getting people talking about uncomfortable topics. I was thinking about this several years ago as I was doing some research for a project I was working on. And I thought, how do we get people who could care less about religion and would just glaze over if I started to talk about religion to them? How can I have those conversations with those sorts of people and make them meaningful conversations? So I got thinking, who are the people out there who are really good at starting conversations about uncomfortable topics with people that don't want to talk about the topic? And I thought of my friends in the pro-life movement in Canada, and they are apologists for pro-life, and they're really good at engaging people. They look them in the eye, usually on the street at a busy part of Toronto, and they look people in, and they do this throughout Canada, but in Toronto is where I saw it with my own eyes. They maybe have a pamphlet or two to hand people if they're interested in information, but they stand there, and as people walk by, they just kindly look them in the eye, and they say, "What do you think about abortion?" Now, when someone asks that question, it's not necessarily clear what the asker thinks about abortion. So there's no sort of subconscious or hidden way of imposing your view on the other person. You're just asking, you're curious, what do you think about abortion? And that is often enough for them to engage people and to have a meaningful, often fruitful conversation. Doesn't mean they're changing minds on the spot, although they do sometimes. But a simple question like, what do you think of X, Y, or Z can be a really great way to start these sorts of conversations. So those are the what do you think of conversations. You could also ask, what do you mean by questions? It's important to make distinctions. You got to make distinctions, but then challenge the person you're talking to make distinctions, because that sometimes is the biggest roadblock towards having a fruitful conversation. Is they mean something by a particular term or phrase that you haven't identified. You think they're talking about something else, and so you're talking around each other. Ask them to make distinctions. Robert Sokolowski, the great Catholic philosopher, says that philosophy is the art of making distinctions. And that's what we're doing as apologists in these conversations. N.T. Wright tells this story. He's got an article online. You can find it just by Googling it. It's called Jesus and the Identity of God. So Anglican theologian N.T. Wright talks about his time at Oxford as a chaplain. And while there, he would, at the beginning of every year, he would meet the new undergraduates just for a minute or two to introduce himself and to get acquainted with them. And so they would come in and he would introduce himself, and they would often kind of sheepishly say, to be honest with you, you probably just won't be seeing much of me this year. And he would say, well, why not? And they would say, well, you see, I don't believe in God. And he would always say, well, which God don't you believe in? And they would go on to describe, God something like this being up in the sky who looks down disapproving on the world and maybe from time to time works a miracle or two, and then ultimately just sends the good people to heaven and the bad people to hell. And after they would share their description of the God they didn't believe in, Wright would often reply, well, I don't believe in that God either. And they'd say, which God do you believe in? And he would say, well, I believe in the God revealed in Jesus Christ. And that's not the God revealed in Jesus Christ. And so there we have this great Christian theologian who is showing us in a simple way the art of making distinctions. And by making that distinction, not only did he elicit an interesting conversation with the person he's talking to, but he also himself made it more clear of where he needed to begin with that particular student. So that's another great way to ask questions, is the what do you mean by questions. All right, let's move on to number 6. Be totally honest. Don't be afraid to set constraints with the person that you're speaking with. So for example, you're gonna have conversations with people who get a little testy. You yourself might get a little bit temperamental. It's okay to be honest and say, look, you're clearly bothered by what I've said here, and you're not being honest, or maybe you're just insulting me, and this hasn't really turned into the sort of conversation that's going to get anywhere. So either you need to chill out a little bit and be more respectful, or else we'll have to come back to this conversation at another time. So that might be an example of setting constraints, expectations, just to make it clear that you're interested in having this conversation and listening to the other person, but there's got to be some barriers in place to keep things going in a fruitful and productive direction. So be honest about your expectations. Also admit your ignorance. So be honest about when you don't know the answer to something. And you've heard this before. But, I think there's two ways that we can do this. Number one, if somebody challenges us or asks a question or rebuts an argument we've made and we don't know how to respond, number one, don't try fake it or come up with some kind of response that you think doesn't reveal that you don't know the answer. Just straight up admit the truth. Be truthful, and that often will earn you some credibility. And it doesn't mean you've lost the argument. Remember that it's not a game. I mean, in the sense you're not going to lose the argument because you're not playing a game. And the argument doesn't necessarily end there. You can do a couple things, as I said. Number one, you can say, I don't know the answer to the question that you're asking, but I know a resource that would be really helpful for you. And you can give them a resource or tell them where to go, where they can find it. Or you can just get back to them, say, I'm going to look into that. I wish I knew the answer to that. Or great point. Yeah, that seems to refute the argument I just made. I'm going to have to look into that because either I'm going to have to throw this argument out because you've just refuted it, or maybe there's a way for me to strengthen what I've already tried to argue for. Those are two options. Maybe you're going to apply both. You're going to point them to a resource and you're going to find the answer out yourself. And I think that's probably the best way to do it. I remember when I was in my 20s and I was, I've already mentioned, I was in university. There's a time when I was not a believer, was not interested in religion at all. And I was invited to this Bible study. I lived with a guy who was a practicing Christian. And they would invite, he was part of a Bible study, and they would invite me all the time to participate. And I just, because they knew, I had a Bible in my room. I was kind of a fake it till you make it Christian, where I had this cultural appreciation for the faith that I had been raised in, but I really wasn't in a personal relationship with Jesus, and I didn't believe much of what the church taught. But they kept inviting me, and eventually I reluctantly said, okay, fine, I'll come, hoping that would maybe get them off my back. And so we went, and we spent about an hour together reading the Bible and talking about our struggles in life. And this was, at the time, I was playing college football, and the guys that I was playing football with were not the type of guys that I would sit around and talk about my feelings with. And not to say that these Christian guys were not manly men, but this was just a full level of vulnerability that I wasn't used to. And I was so uncomfortable. And plus, talking about the Bible, I wasn't really interested in the Bible. But I persevered, and after that hour was up, I just needed to get out of there. So I rushed to the door. I started putting my shoes on. And the leader of the Bible study came up to me, and he said, Matt, I'm so glad that you came. And, almost just impulsively, I just kind of spit out this question, well, is there even any evidence that Jesus Christ even existed? And it wasn't that I had thought really hard about that question, but I just wanted to provoke, and I had this desire to stump him because I just didn't think that he would have a good answer to that. And he didn't answer me, but what he did is he gave me a book, and that book was The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel. And he said, give this a read and let me know what you think. Now, I don't know if you've read that book. You can find it in every used bookstore that exists today, and it's often for a very fair price. It's a great place to start to get acquainted with arguments for Christianity. And it's essentially a book that came out of this really interesting and great story from Strobel, who is an award-winning law journalist for the Chicago Tribune, I believe. And his wife converted to Christianity, and he wanted to prove her wrong. He thought it was absurd that she would become part of Christianity. And so he made contact with some of the world's greatest Christian scholars to essentially sit down and show that their reasons for being Christian were inept, and he was going to be the guy to disprove them. And so he did, and I'm sure you're familiar with the story. Maybe you've seen the movie that's come out of it. But the result of his research, where he was hoping to refute all these Christians, the result was not what he expected, and he converted and became a Christian believer. So I read that book, and that book, although it didn't lead to my immediate conversion, it was my first encounter with smart Christianity, where I saw there are good philosophical, historical reasons to believe in the things that the New Testament claims. So that's a good book for you to read and to give to others. Let's go to the last point that I'd like to make with you today, and that is argue when necessary. Or let's just put it simple, argue. Today, the word argue or argument has a negative connotation to it, but it doesn't need to. I mean, in past cultures, argument was a staple of a healthy society. How do we solve problems if our greatest minds can't come together, who are inevitably not going to agree on everything, and try to arrive at truth, to seek truth together? That arguing is part of unveiling what's reality. And so don't be afraid. I mean, here's the bottom line. Fence sitters aren't compelling. So if you believe what you believe and you know it in your heart to be true, make that clear to the person you're talking to. And don't be obnoxious, but it's okay to be convicted. That's much more intriguing, much more interesting. And if it's genuine conviction, then that's how you feel. Speak that way. And if you're doing all the other things we talked about, like listening and asking good questions, showing interest in the other person, you're going to be allowed to show your strong convictions without being off-putting. So argue and get good at arguing. Study syllogisms, which are like where you have premises and a conclusion. They're simple ways to make arguments, and they're easily memorizable. So, for example, the Kalam cosmological argument. It's not necessarily the best argument for God's existence that's out there, but I think it's really effective as a sort of introductory argument. So the premises of the argument are everything that begins has a cause. And then everything that begins to exist has a cause. Premise 2 is the universe began to exist. And 3, the conclusion, therefore the universe has a cause. Now, some great Christian apologists like William Lane Craig will argue that if you look into the premises and you look at the argument and how things follow, that you're going to see that this reveals more than just a transcendent cause of the universe, that you're going to get something that appears to be very much like God. Or even he would argue that, yeah, you get the monotheistic God from this argument. Whether you think it can get you that far or not, I think the Kalam cosmological argument is an example of an argument that's easy to memorize. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. Nothing pops into existence out of nothing. The universe began to exist, which, based on modern science, astrophysics, and cosmology, there's good reason to think the universe began to exist, and there's philosophical reasons to believe that there aren't an infinite number of days in the past. So that's how you would defend that premise. And then what follows from premise 1 and premise 2 is if the universe began to exist, then the universe has a cause. But the universe is the sum total of time, space, matter, and energy, which means that the cause of the universe has to be beyond or unbound by time, space, matter, and energy. And what you get is a cause that appears to be something like a transcendent God. So this could just be to get you on the ground, off the ground running. It's an interesting argument, but then you would have to follow that up maybe with better arguments. But memorize arguments so that at a moment's notice you can spout them off and offer some defense for what you believe. Frank Sheed, the great 20th century apologist, is somebody who we can really learn from. So he was a British apologist, and he was part of the Catholic Evidence Guild. And what they would do is they would go to Hyde Park, for example, in London, this big park, and there's this place called Speaker's Corner where people would go and they'd basically stand on a soapbox and they would give a lecture. And so there might be like the Catholics giving 20-minute lectures on why God exists. And then you might have the Marxists arguing for communism. And then you might have, who knows, somebody who loves Shakespeare, who's giving a lecture on Shakespeare, whether he was a Christian or not. And there would be crowds that would come and they would circle around these presenters, and you'd have hecklers, you'd have people who are serious thinkers that want to ask good questions. And the person on the soapbox would interact with the people, and they become masters at handling a crowd. And it was it was street evangelization, and it was very effective. And Frank Sheed was one of the greats in the 20th century. Well, he's written many books since then. The sort of consummate book that sums up all the wisdom he gleaned from doing apologetics on the street in that way is this book, Theology and Sanity, which I would really recommend to you. He also wrote, along with his wife Maisie Ward, the Catholic the Catholic Evidence Outlines or Catholic Evidence Guild Outlines, I can't remember what it is, but look it up online. It's available at EWTN and it's free. And it's basically training outlines for being a street evangelist. And in it, he talks about the arguments that he found in his years of experience being a street apologist, which arguments were most effective, which ones were the least effective. He said that the least effective were the argument for common consent, for example, which is to say, well, everyone has believed this in the past, so we should believe it today. He just thought that didn't stand up well with people. Same thing with the first two ways of St. Thomas Aquinas. So the argument from motion and argument from first cause. He just thought that for the majority of people, they're not philosophically articulate enough or trained well enough to understand the language of the arguments and follow the metaphysical development of them. On the other hand, he did think that the contingency argument, which is St. Thomas's third way, was effective. And so that was his experience. He thought the moral argument for God's existence, the argument from objective moral truths or moral obligations, he thought that was about a 50-50 argument that worked for some and not for others. And he found that the design argument was really resounded with a lot of people. So those are, that was his experience. Granted, that might not be your experience, and that hasn't necessarily been mine. The point is, though, there's a lot of great arguments, not just for God's existence, but for many of the things we believe as Christians. Of course, some things we believe on divine revelation through faith. But as St. Anselm said, we are a faith that seeks understanding. And so we believe things, but we also seek to understand why we believe them. And so knowing these different arguments for the faith that might appeal differently to different people, I think that's important to do. And that's something that we're going to continue to try to do for you in the Word on Fire Institute. I want to recommend one article if you're interested in this street evangelization business with Frank Sheed and the Catholic Evidence Guild in the early 1900s. Read Patrick Madrid's article. It's called The Prophet of Hyde Park, Secrets of a Street Corner Evangelist. Google it. It's free, and it's a good read. And that is the last tip that I have for you. And there's so many other tips I could have provided. I hope these were helpful. We're in this discussion today in the church about what the new apologetics looks like. We all know St. John Paul II talked about the new evangelization that should be new in ardor, method, and expression. And part of evangelization is giving a defense for what we believe. And so apologetics then comes into the picture. And I think we need to consider what it is about the culture we live in, or maybe the location you live in the world, that makes unique demands on how you as an apologist should operate. That's a conversation we need to keep having. But at an individual level, every human being is complex in their own ways. And so in a way, we need a new apologetics for every single person. So just keep that in mind, that it's not an easy task, but it's a task we've been called to defend and explain the faith and ultimately draw people towards Christ. As I close here, I want to recommend a book for all of you. This is absolute recommended reading, and it's not because anyone told me to say this. I really mean this. You got to get Bishop Barron's Arguing Religion book. These are based off of lectures that he gave at Google and was it Amazon? Places that are not religious places. He was speaking, yes, to believers, but also non-believers. And this book is just fantastic. It's a quick read, but it's so substantive and will give you lots to practically apply as an apologist and lots to think about moving forward. So that's it. That's all I got for you in this webinar. I would invite you to come to wordonfire.institute and join me in the forums where I will be this afternoon engaging with you. Go to the general discussion tab, and under there you'll see the webinar link where we will be engaging in discussions. You can ask questions, and let's keep this conversation going. So thanks everyone for joining. Be sure to go to wordonfire.institute. If you're not a member, join us. There's lots of exciting things happening there, and let's continue to proclaim Christ to the culture.